everyone. I'm sorry for the short. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry for the short hiatus. And today we are going to continue where we left off last time, which was discussing the elements of literature. Today we'll be discussing the remaining 5 elements, and I hope that we will, in the time that we have today, get a good enough grasp of the elements to be able to identify them in any way they present themselves in the 3 genres of literature that we have identified in the course of this subject. Just as a short recap, the last time we discussed language, we discussed mood, we discussed setting, and we discussed plot. We identified how this presents in different genres, and we also stated that even though it might not look like it, that all elements of literature tend to present themselves in all 5 elements. And I would like to start with the element of point of view. So essentially, literature works written in the sense that they tell a story or they share an idea. Now, the way this idea is related to the reader is dependent on a number of things, and this is usually termed a point of view. So the point of view is the way that the reader is encountering the story. Are you reading the story through a male character, a figure? Is it being read as if the character is telling the story to you directly, or is it being was it written in such a way that the character telling the story, the narrator, is an all-seeing being, or is it just from their perspective? Essentially, point of view essentially just says that this is how you're seeing the story. Imagine that you are looking at this laptop now and you can only see what you can see from your point of view. You don't know what is happening behind you. You don't know what's happening in the next room. So in the course of this study, in the course of this session, the point of view is first person because you can only tell the story to somebody else in the way that you have experienced it personally and directly. Now, this is just one of the different types of point of view in telling stories or in relating to literature. There are also other types, such as second person, where the narrator relates the stories in the pronouns you. In this sense, the story is told in second person, singular, plural, in the sense that the story is told as if the reader is immense. What is a day? I would like to get to know you better. In this sense, I have used you in 2 ways. First of all, I've used you in the sense that you are the subject of the story. You are the one the story is happening with. In the other sense, the way that the strange man that I walked up to you used you in the conversation that he was trying to track up was as regards to talking to you again, who is the listener. But this is now from a person that is inside the story. So my point is that when a second person point of view is used, it immerses the reader or the listener into the story in the sense that the listener is made the subject of the story. Even though this is not really happening to you literally in the real sense of the word, but the reader they feel that this is I or we. So in this sense, the story is written in the sense that I went to the market and I was shocked to find out that the price of foodstuff have increased exponentially. In this sense, I is a person, is a subject. The story is happening, like is the cause of the story. And in the course of the story, you continue seeing how I tells the story. So the person that is one person point of view is that this is only told from their point of view. How the story is channeled point of view. So in this sense, where I use I as a point of view, essentially you can only know what happens. Like the story is going to tell you only things I have perceived or things I have heard or things I think about. So although it's not uncharacteristic for authors or for writers to mix up different points of views, but essentially authors tend to stick to one, and then the course of the story you only get to see figments or part of the stories that the I narrator have experienced. So yes, for example, in Stephen Chbosky's The Perks of Being a Wallflower, the story is told in a first person point of view, which is why in see, except to be extent that the author introduced that in the course of the book. Sorry, give me a moment. Then the other point of view is third person. So this third person sort of like is an omniscient being that sort of tells the story with an overview of what everybody else is thinking. So um, which I want because of this. In narrator, tells us the story of the characters in a way that a first-person narrator can't. So it is because that a third-person narrator was used that we were able to happen to Onoka, we were able to see what happened to Okonkwo in different aspects. We were able to see different aspects of the story that Okonkwo was not primarily in. So what a person helps the author do is it gives you a broader view of the story. It gives you a richer taste, a wider view of the story you're reading. Because essentially, in a first person point of view, you only get to see this story in the way that the first person narrator tells it. So anything that the first person narrator doesn't tell you, you have to imagine this as many aspects of faces that the author is willing to show you. So yes, that's that about point of view. I hope I've highlighted how the different types and the role they play. I would like to close off by highlighting what the advantages of using either. First view, it's more personal and opinions and ideas in real time. So it is not a case of them relating it to you as an indirect speech. So in the course of doing the work, you read that, oh, I was sad today that my mother beat me, or I went to the market today and I couldn't find rice. I was saddened by that. Or I went on a date with this person and they bought a cake for me. I was so happy about that. So you get to feel this person's emotions. You get to feel the character's emotions in real time, as against having the narrator explain this to you literally. The advantage of a second person point of view is similar to that of a first person point of view. But in this case, it is more personal because whereas the first person point of view tends to highlight emotions as felt by the character who is somebody else, an object in the story that you are only reading. The second person point of view sort of like immerses you in the story and doesn't even so much as explain these feelings, doesn't so much as talk about these feelings, but you as the reader get to feel these things in the course of reading. So for example, where you read about a person getting raped and the second person point of view was used, you get to feel this as the subject of the story, and it helps authors connect the readers to the emphasis they're trying to make in the story. Then for the third person, giving so happily I the control work. like I said already, the point of view, the definitive. So secondly, for the second pronoun such as you sort of like you have to read this in between the lines to get the context. But the you pronoun, the use of the you pronoun in the course of telling the story is sort of like a definitive way of knowing that this story is told in second person point of view. Now, again, I would highlight that using the example I've made earlier with regards to where I say that you are walking on the road and somebody walks up to you and asks you, hey, I want to get to know you better. You have to identify the way that the pronouns are used in the context of the story. So you have to find out when you is the person telling the story and when a character in the story is referring to you in the sense that, oh, he's talking to somebody else in the story and they're using you. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's important to identify the way you is used in the literature work and to know when that you makes it a second person point of view literature work or when it's just a reference to another character in the book. So ordinarily, when you is used in the first person narrative, in the sense that in Stephen Chbosky's Pick Up in a Wallflower, he talks about how he went on to prom with her, and then when he's referring to another character and says, "You did this to me," or "You didn't do this to me," it doesn't mean that that is the second person narrative work. That's just a way of referring to another character in the book. But when the story is told in the sense that you are walking on the road or something, you, and you here is using the context of the person or the subject of the story, that is now what makes it a definitive second person narrative. Then the last one is the third person omniscient narrative. So you know this by the use of pronouns such as they, him, her, she, he. So there's a distanced way that the characters are referred to. It's almost in the same way that you tell stories to your friends or to your relatives about something that you probably have experienced. So you refer to this person in third person. That is what is meant, like a third person narrative, in the sense that you are distant from the story and you are referring to these other people as if they are not in the story at all. So that's that about point of view. The next thing I want to talk about is theme. So theme ordinarily in literature text is referred to as the main idea of the story or the main idea of the literature work. But I beg to differ because theme is basically just any idea that presents in the literature work. You find that in many literature works, and then ideal literature work, you don't just find one theme. There are several themes that usually occur in the course of chapter 1 to the epilogue. And you don't discard any of these things because they're not the main theme or the main idea. So a theme in a literature work is basically all the ideas, any idea that occurs in the course of the literature work. So for example, in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, we have themes of slavery, we have themes of colonialism, we have themes of patriarchy, we have themes of social injustice, we have themes of just social inequality. These themes are not the core theme, as the core theme was the idea of colonialism and how there was an existing African society before the white colonial masters came. But you cannot discuss these other themes that are presenting themselves in the course of the story because they do not tie to this main core theme. Let me repeat that. So for emphasis, theme is any idea that presents in the course of a story. This idea doesn't have to be the main idea. As long as this is an idea that has occurred in the course of the story, then that's a theme. When you're not asked to identify the main theme, you can now point out the main theme that you identify, but just that theme is any idea that presents itself in the course of the story. Now, idea in this sense is not the idea as to a notion of invention. Idea in the course of literature works, like, as we used for theme, is the main message, the main message that is being sought to pass across, the main thing that is sought to be raised or discussed. So as I've mentioned earlier, for Things Fall Apart, we had things about colonialism, we had things about patriarchy, we have things about social injustice, we have things about the African society. We had things about families, we had things about trust, So these themes presented themselves in different chapters of the book of the book here, but they are not the main theme. Now, why is it important to identify theme? So give me one. Why is it important to identify theme? So theme sort of like is the basis of the literature work in itself. So because as we identified in the first lesson, literature is geared towards entertaining and educating, sharing ideas and sharing perspective on things. So if a story doesn't have themes, then it doesn't have literature value. And it is very hard to encounter a literature that doesn't have literature value, because even in the course of entertaining, there are themes that keep presenting themselves. You find that most of the comedy or comical books or comical literature works that we encounter still have themes at their heart. So when you watch when you read dramas such as Our Husband Has Gone Mad Again, even though it's funny, you find that there are themes in there about patriarchy, about misogyny, about social injustice. Even as you're laughing, the playwright tries to tackle these things, tries to tackle these issues in the way the characters relate to themselves and the way they relate to these problems. So themes present themselves in all literature works, and it's important to identify them to know why this book was written. So in the course of your exam, in the course of your exam or in the course of your study, it's important to identify the themes that present in any given literature work you're studying, as this is the basis that you'll be examined on. As the examiner will want to know, okay, did you read this work? What did you derive from this work? What was the main theme? What was the main thing you learned? Essentially, because themes is what leads you to get the moral lessons of the book or the literature work. So the examiner is usually interested in knowing that you are not just entertained, but you are also educated by the literature work you encounter. Hello? Hello? Okay, I heard something there. I wanted to be sure that I wasn't the one being referred to. Okay, so yes, let me continue. So that's for team. So to identify the team, you just sort of see it present themselves in the course of the story, and it helps if you are attuned to the social environment that the story was written in. So, for example, Things Fall Apart was set at a time that colonialism was at its height between the 1800s and the early 1990s. Early 90s. So this sort of like gives you an idea of the theme to look out for, and it is the key to identify the themes in any given literature work. So to identify the theme, you know where the story is set. You have to identify the core issues that the characters are facing, and then you now have to identify what led to those issues. In the course of your exam, they might not be asked to examine how the characters responded to these issues and stuff like that. But these two factors, the setting and then the core issues faced by the characters, is basically the key to identifying the theme in any given literature work. So, for example, in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the characters faced issues, the two major characters, as Romeo and Juliet, faced issues as to how to get married without, in the face of the ongoing rivalry between their families and the issues that brought up. This sort of like helps you. The fact that this story was written in the 600s, between 600 and 700 AD, helps you understand how society was structured then as a very, very capitalist, and then there were very strong family ties at that point in time. So it was important that the characters get their family in their marriage. This also helps you identify how the rivalry between families capitulated in the issues that led to the death of the characters. I don't want to spoil the story for people who are not ready, but it's important that you need to understand that the theme of love, of trust, of forgiveness, of mending fences is driven by issues encountered by Romeo and Juliet as set in the time that the plot took place. So yes, I hope that makes things make sense, I think. Then the next thing is diction. So there's another element of literature is the diction. So the diction is sort of like the language being used. I think we mentioned this the last time. The language being used sort of like sets the tone for how the literature work goes. It goes hand in hand with language as regards to, like, it's not just about English language, but the level of English language that is being used in the literature. Then the next element of literature is characters. So characters are basically the subjects or the objects of the literature being engaged with. So in Things Fall Apart, encounter characters like Okonkwo, like Ezema, like Ekwefi. These are characters that the story was basically about. Okonkwo being the pivotal character, dominated the story, but then you had minor characters play a significant role on Okonkwo. People like Onofia, who's Okonkwo's father, had immense influence of Okonkwo. Now, these characters are objects or subjects that the author or the writer is using to drive the story. Like we identified the last time, there is plot. Plot is basically the story that is being told. Now, the characters are the figments of the way the character is telling the story. So imagine a chessboard. A chessboard is the plot. A chessboard is the foundation of the story. It is how the story is meant to go along. Now, the chess pieces, the pawns, the knights, crook, the castle. These are the characters in the story. The plot is basically written, and these characters are just supposed to move along the chessboard to tell the story. In the same way, the plot of literature work is basically the foundation of the story. Now, the characters of the literature work is how the story progresses. They are the ones that drive the story. The characters are dependent on several other things, but basically the author is left at their whims and caprices to pick anything. They can make any character in any way they want, but the defining thing is for them to use these characters to drive the story and elicit the themes that they think are important in reaching the end goal, which is the end of the story, and make sure that the reader or the listener is educated and entertained at the same time. Now, characters can be in different ways. You can have flat characters, you can have round characters. Now, flat characters are basically characters that are typecast, like they are almost molded and they don't change, they don't morph, they are basically fixed in the way they are. They're not complex, they are just there. Like in some ways, we consider them simple characters because they are there merely to play one or two roles, and that's about it. So, for example, in Things Fall Apart, Okonkwo's friend, Ezife, is basically a little bit of a flat character because he doesn't go out of character at any time. He's not complex. He's not engaged in a wide range of ways. He basically is just there to be Okonkwo's moral compass. So in that way, he's a flat character because there's not much to him. However, Okonkwo is a round character in the way that he was really fleshed out. And because of reading the book, you get to encounter Okonkwo in different variants, in different ways, in different situations. And we get to see the complexities in the way that Okonkwo reacts to these issues. So, for example, even though Okonkwo is a stoic man in the way that he is very aggressive and tackles issues head on, he becomes somewhat emotional when his daughter becomes sick. His daughter, the sickle cell, the one that was considered to be an Obanje, when she was at the verge of dying, and then the priestess had to take her. We see Okonkwo's a little emotional side in the way that he comes to sympathize, like he reacts to his daughter's illness. In the same way, Okonkwo's anger is also another aspect of this complexity because it sort of like shows that this is why he's aggressive. This is what drives aggressiveness, and it sort of like balances out, this is who Okonkwo is, and he gets off at the end of the book book, understanding Okonkwo a little bit more better, and being able to predetermine or premeditate on what he does than you could any of the other flat characters in the book. I don't know if that makes sense so far, but that's basically it. So yes, in the course of the book, you usually have the protagonists, and then you have antagonists and stuff like that, depending on which the author has chosen to use, because it is at the author's discretion to pick these things. There might be because it's at the author's discretion to pick these things, he might just choose to do anyone he chooses to do. But the protagonist is basically the good guy. In our local parlance, we call him the actor. So he's the good guy. He's the one who's basically on the side of the good and driving the story. And then the antagonist is basically the other person that's supposed to be. Well, I'm going to use what I'm going to introduce the next element, conflict. Whilst the protagonist is on his own, trying to progress, trying to do his thing in his circle, the antagonist is basically there to introduce conflict and drive the story forward. So, although in most literature works lately, writers have become more inventive in the way that they use characters, not just flat and round, but the way they use protagonist and antagonist. The way that it says that the words are such of losing their meaning a little. So in several works lately, you can find characters that are both protagonists and antagonists at the same time. You can find characters that you cannot even peg them whether they are protagonists or antagonists, because their actions doesn't make it easy to put them down in one box. However, for the course of your study, it is important to identify that protagonist is usually the good guy, the person that is driving the story, the first person you take up in the story. Now, the antagonist is basically the person that is introducing the conflict, that is antagonizing the protagonist. I hope that makes sense. So while this is not easy to identify in Tinsuala Part, because there wasn't an easy case of a protagonist character and an antagonist character. In Tinsuala Part, the protagonist was Okonkwo in a wild sense. However, the antagonist is the colonialist rule that sought to stifle the society that Okonkwo was raised and lives in. But to sort of like give a more simplest explanation of protagonist and antagonist ideas, or protagonist and antagonist characters, let us examine the work of this is not so simple. The gods are not to blame. So in the gods are not to blame, the protagonist, as we see in the beginning, ends up being the antagonist too, because there's a prophecy that was told that he would kill his father and then marry his mother, which is what has actually happened. And that means that he's sort of like the antagonist at the same time. But it is important that in the first chapters of the book, it was obvious that he was the protagonist of the book. So essentially, the protagonist is the person the story is about, and then the antagonist is the person that is antagonizing the person that the story is about. I hope that sort of like clarifies things. Then the next thing we are going to examine is conflicts. So I'm just going to mention this in passing, that I think we will encounter this in several situations as we elaborate and then discuss these different literature works that will be done you should encounter in your exam. But the conflict is essentially what introduces the climax. So conflict is basically the situation or the issue or the problem introduced by the antagonist, usually that is sought to drive the protagonist into action or to prepare it. Now, basically, because life is very monotonous, and imagine yourself, you wake up, every day you wake up, you go to school or you go to work, and then you eat, you come back, you eat again, and you sleep, and then the cycle repeats itself almost every day. It's a repetitive act that becomes monotonous. And if you don't introduce conflicts, people will not want to read or encounter literature work. So essentially, conflict is there to introduce some propel the story. Conflict is there to drive the story forward, or to make sure that the story gets some bearing, or you get to be entertained or educated. So that's the role of the conflict. And now to identify that conflict situation, you have to understand how the story was progressing before and then after the conflict. So for example, in Things Fell Apart, life for Okonkwo before the coming of the white man was very different until the white man came around, and then you get to encounter the conflicts. Now, that's essentially conflicts. I hope I've been able to help you identify conflicts in the sense that you have to look at the story and then note the time where issues came up for the protagonist and when the antagonist came to fore, and then how this was resolved. This essentially is how you identify conflicts in a work. Then the last element I want to talk about is the narrator. Now, this ties loosely to the point of view. So the narrator could be a third person sense being. I've already alluded to this in the course of discussing point of view. But you could have a first person narrator, or you could have a second person narrator, a second person narrator, and then a third person omniscient narrator. So the narrator could be the protagonist, it could be a third person that doesn't have anything to do with the story. Essentially, this is how the person encountering the literature work encounters the work, because it is how you get to see the story. So if it is a first person narrator, you can only see what the first person is telling you. If it's a third person narrator, you can only see what the third person is telling you. So yes, I think we have discussed 5 elements of literature today, and I hope I've been able to help you identify the ways to highlight the ways you can identify these elements in different works. Note that these elements present themselves in all genres of literature, not just prose. So for example, in poetry, the protagonist might be the person telling the story, the narrator you might be able to identify the narrator or not, but essentially they present themselves. So, I hope that in the course of discussing the literature works that have been picked out for you in your exam, we'll come to identify and examine these elements of literature in due course. I think that will be starting next week. Also, it's also important to note that yes, as I mentioned before, the elements of literature is not fixed to one particular genre, but their presentation in different genres can be in different forms. You don't expect to see theme in the way that you see theme in prose when you're reading poems. So the theme for the poetry might be, you have to think about it a little bit more figuratively, but essentially these elements present themselves in all genres of literature. So yes, that is all for today. If there's no question, I think that'll be it for me.
Mr. Michael, thank you so much for the class. However, you mentioned that all the elements are also present in the genres of literature. But I will appreciate if you can tell us how best we can identify the genres or the elements in poem. Like when it comes to poetry, how best can we identify these elements? Talking about theme, talking about character, settings, of all the elements. How do we recognize them, or how do we fish them out?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. But yes, I think if I understand your question, you are asking for specifics on how to identify the elements of literature in the other genres of literature apart from prose, especially with regards to prose, right? So yes, while I can give a short breath, I hope, like I said, I hope I will start examining this as we discuss the different literature texts, especially the poems, in the coming weeks. I hope that we'll start with that in at most 2 weeks' time. I think next week's topics a little bit more set. But yes, okay, let me give you an example. It is going to be hard to do this without actually reading the poetry and then identifying these things, which is what I hope that we'll be doing in the course of the next 2 weeks. But you can identify the theme by sort of like reading several stanzas of the poem to know, okay, what is this poem about? What is it talking about? What story is it trying to tell? In trying to identify the story it's trying to tell, you identify the plot. The plot of the poem is basically what's the narrator the author, the poet, has written about. So if it's about Africa, if it's about womanhood, if it's about childhood, it's about child rearing, that is basically the plot. Now, you will get a full idea of this after reading the whole poem. It's not something you can get after the first stanza. Maybe the first stanza has a different plot or has a different idea, but the collective idea of a poem is gotten from the UNICEF standards, right? And like I said, you can't really I don't know how much you can understand without examining a poem, which is now what I hope we can do next week. I'll break that down to you for us in the next week. But you can identify the plots from reading the whole stanzas to know what is the story about. The next thing you can identify in because of a poem is the mood. So after reading the poem, you can kind of feel, okay, am I feeling sad or am I feeling happy? That is the mood of the poem. It's not necessarily that the poem might have said, well, I'm crying or I'm sad. If at the end of the last word of the last stanza, you are feeling sad, then the mood for that poem is pretty much obvious. If at the last word of the last stanza, you are feeling a bit happy, then the mood for that poem is obvious. Then for the characters, it is not certain that all poems don't have characters, but they tend to. So even when a poem is being written for Africa in that sense is a character, because poets might describe Africa in different ways, using different liturgical languages or words, but the subject of the poem is Africa, and in that sense, Africa is a character. We might also have a situation where the poem has more than one character, in the sense that a poem is addressing somebody and it's coming from somebody else. And in that sense, the person that the poem is coming from is also a character. So it is Coy Mistress, where the poet talks about a suitor or a lady he's wooing who has continually turned down his advances. In that sense, the Coy Mistress is a character in the poem. And the person, the narrator who has been trying to woo this mistress is also a character in this poem. So this is how you sort of like identify it. Is a more or less acquired skill, which I hope we can definitely improve on as we go through this study, and then improve our experience on identifying these elements in the different genres of literature, not just poetry, but in drama too. They present in drama too. I think we will encounter difficulties in drama sometimes because it's not, in a sense, it's not rhythmical in the way that prose is. But I hope I've been able to answer your question well enough to tell you that, okay, yes, these elements present in prose, but I will identify these elements in person better as our sessions go on. I don't know if that's like enough answer for you, Sunday.
Yeah, yes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. But the word plot and theme seems so similar. I mean, the definition.
I don't get that. The word what?
Plot. Can you hear me now? Plot.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Plot and theme.
Plot and theme. Yes, they seem more alike. Is there any way you can, give a very short difference between them?
Okay, not short. Like the difference between them is not just short. There's a very large difference between plot and theme. So plots, like I said before, is the story, is the whole story. Like is the story that the visual work is trying to tell you. That is the plot. Now the theme is the idea, any idea that this story is pushing to you. So let me use an illustration. Things Fall Apart, the book, is a plot. From chapter 1 to chapter 19, I think it's chapter 19, that is the plot. The story of how Okonkwo's father was a riffraff who didn't have enough money to feed his family, and then Okonkwo grew up trying to be bigger than his father, and then Okonkwo eventually hung himself. That is the plot. Now, the theme is the ideas that you elicit or you find in the story. So the theme is basically any idea or any notion or any subject. Like I don't like using this word because it might sound a little bit confusing when I use subjects in this sense and then I use subjects to refer to literature in English. But theme is the idea that is encountered in the story. So in the course of reading the work, as we read about Onofia, Okonkwo's father, and how he was borrowing money and how he didn't have enough money. We encountered the idea of poverty because he was poor. He didn't have enough money to do anything. He was borrowing from people. That is poverty. That is a theme. It's an idea that the author has introduced in the work. It's an idea of what's evaluating. That is a theme. Also, in the course of reading the work, we read upon Obanje about children who die and come back to life and die and come back to life, torment their parents. That is also an idea, is a strong concept in Igbo language, but it's an idea that has been introduced in the work by the author. It's an idea what's considering and evaluating. In the course of the work too, we read about how the white men came to Africa, how they came to the community that Okonkwo was living in, and then how they came to disrupt the way of life there. That is also an idea of colonialism. How does colonialism occur? How did it occur in the story? That is an idea that the author has introduced. We also read about a burial ceremony that was being conducted in the story, during which Okonkwo mistakenly fired his gun and killed somebody. We encounter the idea of crime. I mean, Okonkwo was basically punished for that. And we encounter the way that the Igbo society was categorizing okay and munye, in the sense that we are trying to distinguish between premeditated murder and non-premeditated murder. That is an idea of crime. So the idea is basically things that themes are basically subtle ideas that the author have introduced in the course of the work to sort of like highlight or to make you think about things. It is the subtle ways that the author tends to educate the reader or the listener or the person who is encountering the literature work. I don't know if that explains things a little bit more, but like I continue saying, you see these things in more practical ways as we examine the different literature works that have been assigned to us in the course of this subject. So I don't know if that sort of like answers the question a little, or do you want a little more clarification on that?
It did. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know if there's another question. Can end the session.
No question.
Okay, thank you. So it's been nice seeing you guys again. I hope you find this useful. So I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.